Exodus 20, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor, do all thy work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work. Thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. You're going to be teaching the creation week. The creation week, not the creation vague errors of time passing with no one noticing. When God commanded Moses to command Israel to keep the Sabbath day, he set a pattern, or he referred back to a pattern. I worked 6 days, says God. You work 6 days. Same word, yom, in Hebrew. If God is saying, I work 6 long periods of millions of years, and then you do that, and then you rest, there's a problem there. There are other problems. Ever since Darwin came on the scene, intelligent Christians, usually it's the intelligent ones, have been trying to find a way to reconcile Genesis 1 with evolutionary geology. It cannot be done. The evolutionary geologists will not let us. No matter what bone we throw them, they will not accept it, because they hate the idea of a God who absolutely controls history. If we say there's a gap between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 of millions of years, and all kinds of things, all your geological ages can fit in there, and then God recreated, they will say, no, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. That's not uniformitarian science, and there's no evidence of that, and that would disrupt everything and all our possibility of knowing. Forget that one. What if we say, but these days are long periods of time? They will say they're in the wrong order. You have a sun that doesn't come into existence until your 4th age. If we say, well, the sun was really there, it was just hidden, they will say, you're making it up. That's not what your book says. They will say, furthermore, you have birds coming into existence before the reptiles from which we know they evolved. You have plants existing for millions of years before the bees that pollinate them. You're making this up. You are not being faithful to your own text. If we say, it's all poetry, which of course we know means it's not true, because poetry is never true. Ever read the Psalms? They will say, oh fine, whatever. And we will say, we now have an entire chapter that's absolutely meaningless, because none of it happened. Did God create great lights, one to rule the day and one to rule the night? Well, not exactly. He just said something really creative, apparently, but we don't know what or how or anything. Moses is just trying to communicate that God is so great that, like, he could create something like the sun if he wanted to. Not that he actually did or didn't, or we know anything about it, because it's just kind of poetic and literary, and don't ask questions. And worst of all, as we look at this, we have a God who spoke for 20 some odd verses, or 30 some odd verses, and said nothing we can understand at all. And that's at the beginning of his book. What hope does that give us for understanding the rest of his book? But there's order and parallelism and imagery. Yeah, there's that at the cross too, and at the resurrection. Ever notice that when Jesus rose again, the second Adam spoke with a lone woman in a garden? It's Eden all over again. Must be figurative. Or when the women came to the tomb and looked in, they saw this place that the barrier had been opened up, and inside was a bloody slab on which the body of Jesus had lain, and sitting at each end was an angel. It's the Holy of Holies. It must be figurative. Resurrection apparently didn't happen. God's just telling us about resurrection power. By the way, one of our students actually came back from her home church toward the end of last year and said, I've been talking to my youth pastor about this. And he says the important thing is that it's the ideas about salvation that are important. That's good Gnosticism. Or neo-orthodoxy, which is the same thing, basically. It's the ideas. What if an idea does not have concrete form, and what exactly is it? It seems to be just some kind of flutter in the brain. the idea, the doctrine is that God took 6 days to make the universe. The application is, we are therefore to labor for 6 real days and rest the 7th. That's pretty immediate application to covenant life and to worship. These are not vague ideas hung out there simply to awe us with what's ultimately meaningless because it doesn't really say anything at all. This is what God actually did. Could he have done it in millions of years? He could have. He could have done it in a second. He chose 7 days, 6 days and 1 day of rest, because that's how he wanted to do it, and because there were things he wanted to draw out of that for us from the future. For instance, the sevenfold pattern appears again and again throughout Scripture. The speeches of God concerning the construction of the tabernacle, the 7 pieces of furniture in the tabernacle, the 7 Levitical feasts, the 7 parts of the book of Revelation. God keeps using this pattern over and over again. That doesn't mean when he uses it, none of these things happen. Pattern and order and imagery does not mean non-reality. One of the elders in church, who was sometimes amused by my appeals to biblical imagery and metaphor, asked me, "So, what's the crucifixion a symbol of?" And I saw the trap. Not that I would fall for it anyhow, but I said, there are, areas of imagery there. You can think of the dying on a tree, a Golgotha, place of the skull, Goliath's skull most likely. You can think of the crown of thorns on his brow. You can think of the pierced side. But this isn't simple. This is the reality. This is what it's all about. You can have symbol, you can have imagery, you can still have reality. For us as teachers, have your kids memorize the 7 days of the creation week. They should know it backwards and forwards, inside and out, at least as well as they know the 7 days of the week named after pagan gods. Because it's the first chapter, and it's a key to an awful lot that follows.